and his mother Eileen, whose maiden name was Mikola, was married to a man who served in the British military during World War II.
Okay.
Now, when John was just 3 years old, his father died in combat, and Eileen, who also served as one of the first female searchlight operators in the Royal Air Force, ended up falling for an American soldier named Ralph Tessier.
Okay.
Now, Ralph and Eileen were married November 18th, 1944. And when Ralph went back home to America, to Sycamore in 1946, where a case is taking place, he takes Eileen, their newborn daughter, and his now 6-year-old stepson, John, with him. So this is why they have young kids.
Yep.
And
Okay.
So John Tessier, as we'll call him for the rest of the episode, landed in the rural Midwest in 1946. And by most accounts, honestly, he never really fit in there. He didn't connect with other kids while he was growing up in Sycamore. They didn't understand why he spent so much time marching around in camouflage pants, waving a wooden sword. And it was because he was playing like he was in war.
Uh-huh.
And these antics actually earned him the nickname Commando. And they actually labeled him a permanent outsider that came from a foreign land.
Yeah.
But John doesn't really seem to care. He, according to people, was something of a dreamer who preferred to live in his own world. There was one thing about this world, however, that he really liked, and that was a particular American song he loved, When Johnny Comes Marching Home. Most of us has probably heard this.
Is it When the Saints?
No. Nope.
When the Saints go.
No, that's not it. Nope.
Okay, I just played the song a little bit for you and as well as Garavit.
Garavit?
So John liked this song because, as he said, his name is also Johnny, but he also idolized soldiers. One of his earliest memories, in fact, is his birth father in uniform giving him a piggyback ride up the stairs. Now, John dreamed of being the celebrated soldier who came marching home, but wanting a hero's welcome doesn't make you a hero. And when John was just 15 years old, he proved that he was far from his idol when he got expelled for physically assaulting a teacher at school. Now, the details of this incident have been lost to time, but it must have been pretty extreme because he never actually goes back to school. He just kind of milled around town for a while, making a little money, painting signs. Basically, he bided his time in town, now kicked out of school until he could enlist in the military. So right after his 18th birthday, November 28th, 1957, John made an appointment with a military recruiter. They scheduled him a physical exam in Chicago on December 2nd, 1957. Now, on that day, Johnny marches in right on time, but he soon encountered the first major setback of his adult life. Doctors found a spot on his lung due to a childhood infection of tuberculosis.
Oh.
So they tell him, hey, this disqualifies you from service. John is stunned. This is what he's wanted to do his whole life.
Yeah, it's got to be heartbreaking for him.
Until they agreed to let him come back the next day and take the exam again. He comes back, doctors are like, nah, bro, the spot is still there, and he is still disqualified. So John left the Chicago office with his dream in ruins. And it was about 12 p.m. on December 3rd, 1957. And back in Sycamore on this exact day, Maria Ridolph was looking forward to the end of the school day. Clouds were gathering, and again, the first snow of the year was about to fall.
I mean, obviously pieces are starting to, fall together and make sense. I just don't understand. I mean, I'm sure we'll get to motive. It's just confusing.
So what happened next has been a matter of debate ever since.
It's going to be,
but
Garrett.
there are a couple of pretty solid facts.
There's a couple, it's still loose.
John leaves. He's devastated because his dream of enlisting is crushed.
Over, basically.
And he wound up in a town called Rockford. About 45 miles from Sycamore
hello.
and 90 miles from Chicago that night. Now, Sycamore is about halfway in between. He actually placed a collect call from Rockford to his parents' house at 6:57 p.m. And then between 7:15 and 7:30, he showed up to an Air Force recruitment office that had just closed for the evening. He banged on the door until recruiters answered and begged them to take him despite the spot on his lung. John was so worked up when he spoke to the recruiters that they actually thought he was on drugs, but they didn't turn him down and instead they said, hey, just come back in the morning. And this much of this night is verified. But the question remains.
I'm so jealous. Hopefully there's nice plants and, of course, nice reptiles. Don't get me wrong. You know me. I love my plants.
Where was John?
I'm excited. Please do.
He got to Rockford that evening. There's a
I
sliver
need to
of
see
time
all
from
the
time
pictures.
he left the office.
Yep.
And the time he shows up to another recruiter office where he's missing. And that happens to be the same time when Maria disappears.
How did the police figure this out so fast? Like, it seems like they knew exactly where to go.
Well, I'm telling you a little ahead because
Okay.
I already know the killer, so I'm giving you the timeline.
Yeah.
Police haven't really discovered this yet.
Got it.
I'm just telling you after the fact.
Because but they went to somebody's house.
Ooh, that'll be exciting though.
House right away.
They were asking that his parents.
Hopefully
like,
a pretty- hopefully you find a pretty
and
one.
They said, "Hey, we need flashlights to search for her."
Oh, understand.
They don't actually know that he's involved or has anything to do with it. Yes, Maria's parents and the search party are going to his parents and saying, "Hey, can you lend us some stuff to search?"
So it's
tonight?
all going to intertwine with each other.
Yes. And I'm just going to be honest right now. I just told you that there's a chunk of time missing in his story. And that question would actually go on to be debated for the next 55 years. So this case is not
2012?
not getting solved right away.
Get out of here.
So by 8 p.m.
55 years.
By 8 p.m. on the night of December 3rd, all of Sycamore was searching for Maria. Police had set up roadblocks.
Oh,
They
yeah.
searched train cars, truck cabs, the bus station. They scoured buildings and houses, fields and woods.
That's so sweet of Kim's friend. Oh my God.
No one found any sign of her.
So sweet of
However,
them.
one searcher did find her doll in the alley behind Maria's house. And if you remember, she went to get that doll before her friend Kathy left and she was alone with Johnny. So they also had a description of the kidnapper because of Kathy. Kathy had told police the man that her friend was last seen with was blonde and went by the name Johnny. So naturally, they zeroed in on suspects who fit that description. So as early as the next day, word had gotten around that 18-year-old Johnny Tessier, this outcast in the community, was blonde and his name was John and he went by Johnny. So police actually spoke to his mother, Eileen, on December 4th, the next day. And they say, hey, we're talking to anyone who's blonde and fits this description. We know your son. Where was he last night? And Eileen was like, he was home. This is obviously a lie.
Because he wasn't home.
Because he was going around to those offices. Yep. Her other kids had been there, but John hadn't been there. In fact, his half siblings didn't see him all that night or the following day. Some of Eileen's daughters actually overheard their mother talking to police and they knew she was lying. And they actually tried to tell police, hey, we need to talk to you. But the cops don't even give them a chance. They never end up talking to the other kids. They just took Eileen's word for it that her 18-year-old son had an alibi and they moved on to the next blonde.
Crazy. So
that's wild.
She knows about it. It's just like, oh, sorry.
Right.
Her own kid.
Yep.
Other own
so
kid.
Wild.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ironic.
This might not have been a result of negligence so much as a loss of jurisdiction because that same day, December 4th, 1957, the FBI moved in on the investigation. 29 federal agents showed up overnight and took over the investigation, and they asked police for a list of suspects. And in a town where everybody knew everybody, the cops had their own ideas about who might have done this. So they give the FBI a list of known sexual deviants in the area. This included homosexuals. Because
yeah, okay. I was gonna say, oh, come on, but yeah, okay. Given the historical context, yeah, okay. Our weeds here.
Child molesters. Some of them were only known by nicknames. So there's a lot of people on this list. But a few days later, they actually get a tip from an anonymous person telling them to check out John Tressner in the neighborhood for the case. So the feds look into it and they found that John Tressner doesn't exist. But they do find John Tessier, who fits Kathy's description of the kidnapper. So the FBI now are also on to 18-year-old John in a completely different way.
I don't understand how he doesn't get caught.
Either way, they ask John if he can come in and take a polygraph test. And John agrees. So 2 days later on December 10th, John was wired up and questioned. And during the interview, agents asked John if he had ever had sex with children. And he said, yes, sort of.
Wait, what?
He said that he had engaged in quote unquote sex play with a younger girl in the past. But that was years ago, and he's 18 now, and he's outgrown it.
This is insane.
He also lets them know, listen, I didn't even know Maria. I really only met her once 4 years ago. He'd helped her cross the street. They kind of lived in the same neighborhood, and he's like, I've never spoke to her again. I was enlisting in the military that night. And the polygraph showed he was telling the truth. So between the test and his alibi, the FBI are like, hey, he's cleared.
Let me grab a
Once again,
piece.
he's cleared. Just like the local police, they move on.
Okay.
And the next day, December 11th, 1957, John left home to actually join the Air Force. So he was thrilled to be moving on. And as Christmas approached, Maria's family wrapped gifts for her and put them under the tree, gifts they had already bought. But Maria was not home to open them. The holidays came and went. And with the dawn of the new year, it seemed like there was little to hope for. Months went by, no new leads. And then
I'm not surprised you have a bunch of pictures.
Until one day in April 1958, in a wooded area 200 miles north of Sycamore, 2 hikers found a body.
I think about this quite a bit. For some of the cases we do where bodies have never been found.
Mm-hmm. They got to be somewhere.
Crazy how just years later, like hiking trails come up or more houses are built, civilizations growing.
Lakes begin to drain.
And all of a sudden, bodies are just found.
Yeah.
That have been there for decades.
Right. The remains they found that morning, April 28th, 1958, were half buried under a fallen tree. Again, this was 200 miles away from Sycamore. They were so decomposed.
Oh, shit.
That
Oh, my tray or my grinder.
Human, but the hikers were concerned enough to contact the local police, and a coroner soon determined that the remains were human and belonged to a little girl. Now, dots were connected, and Maria's parents, Mike and Francis, were shown a scrap of clothing that was found.
Yeah, what are they supposed to say to that?
As the shirt that Maria was last seen wearing. So soon, the body's ID
Not
was confirmed
good.
in the records, and it was the Riddle's worst fear. It was Maria. So now, even though they knew that Maria was dead, there was still a lot of unanswered questions. How did her body get 200 miles away from home? Who had brought her there? How did she die? Sadly, investigators failed to provide any answers. They didn't take photos at the crime scene.
What?
Nor did they determine the exact cause of death. The autopsy just said suspected foul play.
Because they were just over the case?
I don't know if it's because they just didn't have enough information or they didn't even know if the bones were human at the time. And if this wasn't upsetting enough, the FBI can out of the investigation at this point. Since Maria's body had been found within the state, the case no longer fell under their jurisdiction, so they turned it back over to the Illinois State Police, who, after 2 years of going over the same case, or lack thereof, moved it into cold cases once again. So by the time
Cookie dough or Gushers, chat? What do we smoke first?
Maria's body had been found, John was starting his new life. He served several years in the Air Force and then transferred to the Army. Presumably that spot on his lung wasn't such a big deal when the U.S. finally needed soldiers for Vietnam. So John went on to fight in the Vietnam War. He was awarded 3 Bronze Stars for exceptional bravery.
I'm just letting you guys figure it out.
He was honorably discharged. He got married. He had 2 kids. He then attended Law Enforcement Academy in King County, Washington. And by the time he graduated in 1974 at the age of 35, John was basically the hero he always wanted to be. But to those who knew him, there were signs that he was not the noble soldier he pretended to be on the outside. John's first marriage ended when he cheated on his wife. Once he became a police officer, he used his badge to pick up multiple women. For example, he once arrested a woman for drunk driving and then talked her into moving in with him. He also arrested a sex worker and then took her to a holiday party, like after he arrested her. And after several incidents like this, John was reprimanded by the police in Milton, Washington.
I'm gonna say, wait.
But he continued.
Wait, no one answered my question. Oh, Gushers, so you did. Okay, I see it. Never mind.
Until the early
Gushers.
80s, when his behavior went from questionable to criminal. In 1981, 42-year-old John, who was still a police officer,
was for the weed, yes.
invited 15
I realized you said that.
runaway Michelle Wyman to move in with him. So he comes across her as a cop. She's a runaway.
My bad.
You have nowhere to live. So he poses as
he's always been a pedophile.
Girl's heroic protector. He buys her clothes. He teaches her how to put makeup on. He makes sure she goes to school. But then one night, after she'd been staying with him for just a few weeks, Michelle woke up on the hide-a-bed in John's living room to find him performing oral sex on her. She's 15. He's 42.
Shoot, dude. Lots of words.
She was so scared, she just froze. But the next day, she told a friend what had happened to her, and the friend told a school counselor, and the counselor alerted police in another town. And this led to an investigation in which John was eventually charged with statutory rape. Now remember, 25 years earlier, John had admitted to the FBI, right after Maria went missing, that he had engaged in sexual activity with children. But apparently, no one now in Washington knew about this confession, knew that he had been somewhat of a suspect back then.
This is wild.
So John was actually allowed to plead guilty to a lesser charge of communication with a minor for immoral purposes.
Wait.
Yes.
How does that even happen? How do you go from
honestly, I don't even think you need a history.
A kid to communicating
with a child? He wasn't fired from the police department. He was asked to resign, which meant he was free to keep on reinventing himself. So he leaves the police department. He starts pursuing a business in photography. He begins taking photos of
children,
young aspiring models. And then in 1983, he marries one of them, a woman named Denise Trexler. Denise was coming out of an abusive relationship. He pretended to be her hero once again. But after they married, he became emotionally abusive and controlling. He didn't just buy Denise clothes. He was telling her what to wear. He didn't teach her how to put on makeup. He made her do it a certain way.
Yeah, that's really gross conditioning.
That time, she witnessed at least two things that would haunt her for years to come. One happened on a day when John's daughter from his first marriage came to visit. She was only 12 years old.
Oh, no.
And Denise found John with her one morning in the kitchen, and he was holding a banana. And
I already knew it was going to not be great.
Yeah. The second incident was even more disturbing. One day, Denise was looking for something in John's desk, and she felt a drawer catching, so she lifted it up. And she found something at the bottom of his drawer in his office. And it was a photo John had taken of his daughter. She was naked, his 12-year-old daughter.
Oh my god.
Child pornography of his own child.
This is...
So...
he's just a straight up... he's a pervert. He's a pedophile.
Yes. So Denise and John break up in 1989, and unfortunately, she didn't report any of these things for years to come.
There better not be any pedophiles listening to this podcast. To turn it off right now.
Yeah,
okay.
Stop. Yes, I agree. If you're a pedophile watching my stream, leave right now. Click that little X button. Don't come back.
Oh, sheesh.
Don't go get help. Put him in prison. Let other people take care of the issue, and bada bing, bada boom.
So John keeps moving. His photography business never made enough to actually pay the bills. So in the early 90s, John got a job driving for a limo company in Seattle.
I get where you're going. I get where you're going, Bean. You're fine.
And then in 1993, he proposes, Sue accepts, but before they get married, John makes an interesting move.
Okay, I get where the joke is going.
You're fine. From John Tessier to John McCullough. Now,
I've heard way worse. Today, I've heard way worse that weren't jokes. So
he said he wanted to honor his mother.
You good?
But it's also possible that John had an ulterior motive. By now, he was 54 years old. He was getting ready to settle down. Maybe he wanted to put some...
I know it's gross that we have to say that hurts, but trust me, that's coming from somebody that works pretty close with kids and make sure that they're safe and everything.
some distance between himself and his sordid past. If so, John was about to be disappointed because while he was getting ready to start another new life in Seattle, back in Sycamore, his mom Eileen's life was coming to an end.
Okay.
And she was about to blow the past on her son's life wide open. But also, remember when you were like, if she knew this whole time and didn't say
she knew the entire time, didn't she?
Oh, yeah.
And it finally caught up to her, and she's dying, and she's thinking,
I'll say something now.
I gotta tell the truth. Which, you know
hell?
what?
I gotta come clean before I die. Fuck off. Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
I'll agree with Garrett on that one.
Since Maria Ridolf's disappearance in 1957, Ralph and Eileen Tessier had remained in Sycamore.
And jokes for different
Had mostly
folks.
gone their separate ways. One who remained in her parents' orbit, however, was their daughter Janet. Now, Janet had only been a year older than Maria when Maria disappeared. But she felt like she lived her whole life under the shadow of that kidnapping, of that trauma. She grew
I
up with
bet.
a
Yeah, I guess she was close to that friend, right?
And that anxiety extended to relationships with her family. It wasn't just her family. She felt like her DNA was screwed up. She would tell people, I just break everything I touch. Now, despite this black
that's so
sheep
sad.
status, or maybe because of it, when Janet's mother, Eileen, got cancer in the early 90s, Janet became one of her caretakers. So one day in late 1993, Janet was staying with her mother when all of a sudden, Eileen, her mother, is calling her name. And Janet rushes to her mother's bedside, and she was concerned by the urgency in Eileen's voice. She suddenly felt her mom's hand clamp down on her wrist, and Eileen pulled Janet close. She said, those two little girls and the one that disappeared, John did it, and you have to tell someone.
What
now,
the freak?
Janet is shocked because right away she knows that her mom is talking about Maria Ridolf. And you have to imagine.
It's her daughter, though, too.
Became terrified of being kidnapped when I heard about Elizabeth Smart, who lived an entire state away from me. Imagine a girl you knew who was just a year younger than you, who lived in your neighborhood, goes missing. She's terrified by this, and now her mom is telling her that, hey, all these years you've lived in terror and worried about this girl. It was your brother.
It was that close to home. That's
so
wow.
By Eileen's tone that she didn't even know how to respond. She just told her mom, okay, don't worry, I'll take care of it. And then Eileen fell back against the pillow, and it looked like to Janet a huge burden had just been lifted off her mother. A few weeks later, on January 23rd,
That feels very weird.
She passes away, and Janet's like, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go to police and tell them what my mom said. She knew beyond a doubt that her mother was telling the truth. Again, she thinks her family's messed up.
Yeah.
She wanted to fulfill her promise by convincing officials to reopen the case and look into her brother. Now, that turned out to be a lot more difficult than Janet imagined. She started by calling the Sycamore police, telling them, I have a lead in this murder, kidnapping. And Sycamore PD give her the runaround. So she tries calling the FBI in Chicago, and they're like, no, you need to call Sycamore. So she tries Sycamore again. And like literally no one will listen to her for years. Nothing happens. And then one day in October 1997, a detective named Patrick Solar, who'd recently graduated from the FBI Academy, announces to the media that he had solved this case. Using an FBI offender database, Patrick had connected Maria's murder to a string of similar crimes committed by a transient truck driver in the 50s. This truck driver apparently resembled Kathy's description of Johnny from that day. And he's dead now. So there's no trial, no further investigation.
What?
Case closed.
This is
And
so
Janet's
confusing.
like, no, there's absolutely no way this case is closed. For years, she's like, how did I have this wrong? How did my mom have this wrong?
No.
And so Janet also remembers, hey, me and my siblings clearly remember my mother lying to police that night.
Yep.
And we thought it was strange, and we were going to tell them.
Right.
We never got a chance to talk to them, and we were just like, okay. So finally, in 2007, half a century after Maria's disappearance, Janet met a true crime author who'd written a book about a cold case. She couldn't help asking, hey, how do you go about reopening a case? And the author's like, listen, you just need to find the right investigator who's ready to look into this.
And they'll reopen it.
Yeah, someone who wouldn't give up. So after all her years of effort, Janet wasn't sure that person existed in Sycamore, but she decided to give it a try. So in September 2008, Janet sent an email to the Illinois State Police, and it said, Sycamore, Illinois, December 1957. a 7-year-old child named Maria Ridolph vanished. Her remains were found in another county several miles away. I still believe that John Samuel Tessier was and is responsible for her death. And this is the last time I'm going to mention it to anyone. So she's like, I'm done. I'm done trying. I'm going to send one last email and I'm going to relieve this weight. But this time, it worked. A commander in the Illinois State Police called her after reading her email. And he's like, hey, I'm going to put one of my detectives on this. And she was like, okay, maybe this is a sign. Maybe I'm fulfilling my mother's dying wish. So after that conversation between Janet Tessier and the commander in the Illinois State Police, 2 new detectives were now assigned to the cold case. Their first step was to re-interview witnesses. So they started with Janet and her siblings. Because if you remember in the case notes, it shows that they have talked to her brother twice. So they talked to Janet and her siblings and they find some eye-opening information. They learned that all of the kids knew their mother had lied to police. And they also heard other disturbing tales, such as that John had actually sexually abused one of his sisters.
Okay.
Upon interviewing other witnesses, detectives also learned that there were contradictions in his timeline. Early reports estimated the time of disappearance at 7 p.m. However, witnesses are like, no, it actually happened between 5:50 and 6:20. So John being somewhere and then being somewhere else doesn't really matter because that time frame could still be there. He could have kidnapped Maria at 6:15, killed her, and then gotten to Rockford by 7 to make that call at home. Detectives knew they were onto something, but they needed more. So in September of 2010, they tracked down Maria's old friend Kathy, which was probably absolutely insane to her. And they show her a series of photos. They're like, hey, we've reopened the case. We have some photos from back in that time. Do any of these men look like the guy? She's now 61 years old. She looks at all the pictures and she points to John Tessier and says, that's him. That's the guy who took her.
Holy crap.
So by now, John was going by Jack. He was 71 years old. He was living in Seattle with his wife, Sue. He worked as a night watchman for an upscale retirement home. So one morning after his shift, the Illinois State Police detectives approached him, along with a couple colleagues from Seattle PD. They told John, hey, we need your assistance on a break-in that has happened at a building that he worked. And John's like, okay. But when they get him to the police station, they're like, actually, we want to discuss this little girl who went missing years ago when you were just 18 years old. They conducted an 8-hour interrogation during which John not only admitted to knowing Maria, but he actually expressed like this kind of worship. Yeah, for her. He was like, she's lovely. She was so lovely. She looked like a little Barbie doll.
What? That's so disgusting. That is so gross, man.
He never confesses.
Get out of here.
Yeah, to kidnapping or murdering her. But prosecutors who reviewed the tape were certain he was guilty. And on July 1st, 2011, John was arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder. He was transported to Sycamore. The judge understood the gravity of the case, and he was like, listen, this is a trial that this community has wanted for 55 years. This was such a big deal. So he makes the rules clear. He says, hearsay evidence, inadmissible. So this meant FBI documents from the first investigation couldn't be used in trial because the agents who created them were dead. You had to have actual first-person testimony. But this was actually a blow to the defense. As it meant they couldn't use the report that stated John had been interviewed and cleared back then. So meanwhile, the prosecution had their own concerns. There's zero physical evidence. No DNA, no weapon.
Shouldn't be able
Even
to.
Maria's doll had been lost.
Yeah, because of that specifically.
In the past 50 years. So this entire case hinged on a witness testimony, and that was Kathy, who was there when her friend was kidnapped. And luckily, he was found guilty. The people in this community finally had the answers they'd been seeking for over 50 years.
Crazy.
So after the conviction, John, who's now 73, was sentenced to life in prison. But his wife and stepdaughter continued to believe he was innocent.
Oh, get up.
They were like, we've never seen him be abusive or show interest in young girls. And they believe he'd been given an unfair trial. And in 2015, his daughter succeeded in convincing State Attorney Richard Schmack to review the case. Richard went back to the original FBI files, the ones that weren't admitted during trial. He disregarded witness statements indicating that Maria was abducted at an earlier time. And he's like, this time that they first were told was 7 p.m. And if that's true, we know that John couldn't have done this because he was calling home.
My God.
So he's like, John was wrongfully convicted. Richard sent John's case to a different judge who agreed with him. And on April 15th, 2016, that judge vacated the conviction and declared John innocent of Maria's murder.
What the?
So only 4
Jesus,
years
what?
after this community thought the case was closed, it was open again. And according to reporters, Maria's family showed little emotion after this verdict. Probably not a big surprise.
Yeah,
They knew the world could be a terrible place. And as of this recording,
Holy
John Tessier is still alive and still free.
And is still a pervert.
And Maria,
The family can sue me. He is a pervert.
that's not.
I don't think that